Welcome to the Virtual Pathfinder channel. In this video series we will take a look at zoom lenses, and in this first video I will test the Panasonic Lumix Vario 14-42mm F3.5-5.6 micro four thirds zoom lens. This lens is sold as part of a package along with a camera body as a kit lens. It is also sold as a standalone product. There is a difference between the two products that is visible, which is the bayonet mount, the part closest to the camera, which is made of plastic for the kit lens. And from what I've read about the standalone product, that part is made of metal. Although plastic may not necessarily be a bad choice as material, it gives the impression of being less solid, which I guess is the reason for not using it when selling the lens as a separate product. I don't know for sure if there are any other differences between the two, but it would surprise me if the optics was different. If there would be any difference, the standalone product would likely be the better one. Before taking a closer look at this lens, I would like to say a few words about zoom lenses in general and how they fit in the micro four thirds system. Zoom lenses are practical since they act like several prime lenses in one single lens, which means it's not necessary to change lens when changing focal length. The camera bag gets lighter and smaller with fewer lenses, which is convenient. So why use fixed focal length prime lenses? One reason is that the prime lenses usually have larger maximum aperture, and they also usually have better image quality. When doing optical design for a prime lens, there are fewer parameters to consider when the focal length is fixed. My personal preference is prime lenses for this reason. Still, there are situations when I use zoom lenses, for instance when I go hiking in the mountains and I want the photography equipment to be light and small. When I start doing this review, I had very low expectations for this zoom lens, but I was positively surprised. Image quality was a bit better than expected. Let's have a look at it. This is a review of the Panasonic Lumix Vario 14-42mm zoom for micro four thirds cameras. We will take a closer look at all important aspects of this lens. If you're interested in photography, lenses and camera equipment, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I'm interested to hear your opinion about this lens. Please write what you think about it in the comment section below. The lens in this review has focal length 14-42mm, which is a very useful range. It can be used for portrait as well as landscape photography. It corresponds to 28-84mm focal length for a full frame camera. This is a very compact and lightweight lens. It was released several years ago and can be bought at a very affordable price or even very cheap second hand. First I will have a look at the physical aspects of the lens, then the specified optics and functionality, before moving on to various aspects of image quality. Finally I will present my conclusions about the lens, with some comments about how to use it and what kind of photography it's good for. Let's start with the physical characteristics of the lens. I measure the weight to be about 107 grams without the lens cap or hood, which is very light. I found the length to be about 50 millimeters, which is very compact. The filter thread has 46mm diameter. The lens has many plastic parts, which makes it feel really light, but it also makes it feel less of a high-end lens. There is a plastic focusing ring without any scale. It has no stops, just direction, so it's not possible to find the near focused or infinity by looking at the focus ring. Most people will probably use autofocus most of the time, then this is not an issue. There is also a plastic zoom ring, which has a scale indicating the focal length. There is no aperture ring, which I think is perfectly okay. If the aperture is set manually, it's better to do it from the camera body instead of using an aperture ring. The advantage of doing so is that you can easily see the aperture setting in the finder, especially in darkness, and it is also good to be able to do it while aiming the camera. The lens is not weather sealed. If you intend to use it outdoors in bad weather, then that needs to be considered. The focal length is 14 to 42mm as previously mentioned. That corresponds to 28 to 84mm lens for a full frame camera. It has aperture settings between f3.5 and f22 at 14mm focal length and between f5.6 and f22 at 42mm focal length. The aperture has 7 circular diaphragm blades. The closest focus is 0.2 meters, which allows a bit of macro photography. The lens has support for autofocus and aperture control from the camera, which makes it easy to take quick shots. There is also image stabilization in this lens. I use Olympus cameras, which have image stabilization in the camera body. For that reason, this is not an issue to consider in my case. But if you use a Panasonic camera, that is good to know. The lens communicates EXIF data to the camera. In other words, the focal length and aperture settings for each shot is saved to the image files. This is a side-by-side comparison between an Olympus 45mm prime lens and this zoom lens. And as you can see, the zoom lens is a bit soft in focus at the top of the image. And when zooming in, you can see that the sharpness is better for the prime lens. Both images are shot with f5.6. And as mentioned earlier, it's also possible to use a larger aperture for the prime lens. It goes to f1.8. Let's have a closer look at some images I shot on a trip to Italy, where I brought 2 zoom lenses instead of several prime lenses. The reason for doing so was that I was going to go hiking in the mountains in the Dolomites, and I had a stop in Venice where this image is shot, and as you can see, this image is relatively sharp all over. The focus point is presumably on one of the boats, but most of this image is sharp. As you can see, it's very much detail on the roofs and the antennas, and it's not really sharp down to the pixel level, but it's very good sharpness overall. There's a hint of purple fringing on the left corner of the image, but hardly visible. It's shot at aperture f5.1. Here's another image which is shot at aperture f10, and it has even more depth of field. It's a canal with gondolas, and as you can see, it's sharp all over the image. But as mentioned before, it's not sharp down to the pixel level. Still, it's a very nice rendering in the image, and it looks good. What I can say about this zoom lens is that the focal lengths within this range from 14 to 42mm is extremely useful. You can get the wide-angle shots of buildings, but you can also get details of the buildings by using the 42mm focal length. Here's another image shot just after sunset. The focal length is 42mm and the aperture is set at f5.6. Even in this dark environment, there's lots of detail and not too much noise. The overall sharpness of this image is good. What I find most impressive with this image is not the details on the buildings and the roofs. It is rather the moon over the buildings. If you have a close look at it, you can see that there's lots of details on the moon. It's almost possible to see hints of the largest craters. This is a low light shot at 42mm focal length, and at aperture F3.5-5.6. The shutter speed in this image is 1 second, and the reason that is possible is the in-body image stabilization in my camera. The ISO value in this image is set at 1600, which is slightly high, and there is a little bit of noise in the image due to the low light conditions. But it's not disturbing in any way. The image looks good. The problems with noise and sharpness would become visible if the image would be cropped and magnified. Here's another image showing the sharpness in low light. What I want to show with these images is that although this lens has very small maximum aperture, it is still possible to take relatively good low light images, but it requires higher ISO value and slower shutter speeds. But it is possible. Here's another low light image which shows a bit of a chromatic aberration, or first of all it shows flare or diffraction in these strong lights, and if we move on to the other side of the image, you can see some purple fringing around the bright light sources, which is chromatic aberration. This image shows the chromatic aberration during daytime. It can be seen in the highlights, in the reflections in the water as purple fringing. It can also be seen on the buildings when you have high contrast, dark areas against the clear blue sky. It is a very limited amount of flare in daylight. I would say it's well controlled. There is some flare in nighttime in images with strong light sources against dark background. There may also be a little bit of ghosting in the images as well. Due to the small maximum aperture, it is hard to blur out the backgrounds unless those are very far behind the foreground. In those cases, the bokeh looks good, although it's not possible to blur it out completely. I have taken photos of a test pattern using various apertures to check if there's vignetting or distortion in the images. The resulting images shows almost no distortion, but there is a certain amount of vignetting even for small apertures. When looking at the center and edges of the test images, it's possible to see the sharpness of the different aperture settings. Although this lens is not as sharp as most prime lenses, it has surprisingly good center sharpness, but it falls off towards the edges, to a level visible when zooming in or cropping the image. The overall impression is okay, but not exceptional. There is a hint of chromatic aberration, which also reduces the contrast a bit. The chromatic aberration is limited, but visible even for quite small apertures. My impression of the color rendering is that it's quite neutral and maybe slightly blue. The typical use for this kind of lens is for portraits without shallow depth of field, people photography, street photo, mainly daytime because of the small aperture, wide-angle landscape photography. Here are my conclusions about this lens. A summary of the negative and positive. First, the negative. This is not the sharpest lens. It has a plastic feel with a very simple focus ring. It has a bit of chromatic aberration and vignetting in the images, and it's not weather sealed. The positive: this is a very compact, lightweight lens. It has little distortion and very good center sharpness. It has support for autofocus, automatic aperture control, and it has image stabilization. The focal length range is extremely useful. This lens is quite cheap, but it doesn't deliver top performance, so the price level seems reasonable. Now in the year 2020, the price is about $200 or 200 euro. On the second-hand market, it can probably be found at around $80, which is a bargain considering the usefulness of the lens. There are probably similar zoom lenses from other manufacturers, but I will compare to the alternative of buying prime lenses, at least 3 of them, which would enable low light photography and blurred out backgrounds at the same time as the image quality would be much better. But that would also cost more than 3 times the price of this lens. So is it good value for the money? My conclusion is the price is reasonable for the performance of this lens. On the second-hand market, the price is usually much lower, which can be a very good value for the money, depending on what the price tag is.